The iron straps across the old garden gate hadn't been touched in 15 years, rusted solid where they crossed the weathered wood. Every nail was still driven deep, every board sealed tight against the brick wall. But on the morning of March 17th, 1832, Ruthanne White was gone, and where she'd last been seen standing, white camellias bloomed in the frost, though it was weeks too early for flowering. The gate remained sealed. The guards swore no one had passed them in the night. And in the soil beneath those impossible blossoms, her footprints led directly to the sealed gate and simply stopped, as though she'd walked straight through solid wood and iron into somewhere else entirely. What happened in those final hours before dawn? Could a woman bound by chains find a doorway that existed beyond locks and nails? And if she truly walked through that gate, where did it lead? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Charleston's spring arrived with humidity that clung to skin like a second layer of clothing, and Ruthanne White had learned to move through it as though it were water, her body finding economy in every gesture because wasted motion meant wasted strength, and strength was the only currency she truly owned. She was 26 years old that March, though she'd stopped counting birthdays after she turned 14 and her mother had been sold downriver to a rice plantation in Georgia. The Pemberton household owned 32 enslaved people, and Ruthanne worked in the main house as a lady's maid to Constance Pemberton, the merchant's wife who collected camellias and kept journals filled with pressed flowers and bitter observations about Charleston society. The garden gate that would later become the center of impossible speculation stood at the eastern edge of the Pemberton property, set into a brick wall that separated the formal gardens from the narrow alley behind the house. Master Pemberton had ordered it sealed in 1817 after his eldest son, drunk on whiskey and rage over gambling debts, had used it to sneak out at night and eventually disappeared entirely, leaving behind nothing but creditors and a pregnant laundress who killed herself in the Cooper River. The old man had taken hammers and nails and iron straps salvaged from a shipwreck, and he'd sealed that gate himself. Working through a summer afternoon while sweat poured down his face and he muttered about shame and recklessness and the corruption of easy exits. Ruthanne had watched him do it from the kitchen window, and even then, young and still foolish enough to pray. She'd thought about doors and the men who believed they could control who passed through them. Her own mother had walked through a door not 6 months before, the last time Ruthanne ever saw her. Hands bound behind her back and tears making clean tracks through the dust on her face. Master Pemberton had sold her to pay for repairs to his shipping warehouse after a fire had gutted the building, and he'd done it without discussion or warning, the way a man might discard a worn-out coat. Ruthanne had learned then that doors meant nothing, that every exit was a lie because there was always someone who could drag you back or push you through against your will. But the garden gate fascinated her anyway, perhaps because it was so deliberately closed, so emphatically refused. She would walk past it in the early mornings when she carried wash water to the courtyard, and she'd study the way rust had welded the iron straps to the nails, the way the wood had weathered to silver gray, the way trumpet vines had grown up and over it until the gate seemed less like an exit and more like a shrine to staying put. Sometimes she'd press her hand against the wood, feeling the warmth the sun had left there, and she'd imagine what it might be like to simply walk through it, to have the nails dissolve and the iron fall away and the world split open into somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't include auction blocks and bills of sale and the wet sound of the whip on Robert's back after he'd talked back to the overseer. Robert was 42 and had belonged to the Pemberton family since he was 7. Brought from Virginia in a wagon with 6 other children after Master Pemberton's father had purchased them from an estate sale. He worked as the head gardener, and his hands had shaped every flower bed and pruned every tree on the property. but his back carried the history of every moment he'd forgotten to pretend he was less intelligent than the white men who owned him. He and Ruthanne had developed a careful friendship built on shared silences and the understanding that came from living in a world where your very existence was defined by someone else's property claims. They talked sometimes in the early mornings before the household woke, standing near the sealed gate while Robert tended the camellias that Mistress Pemberton prized above all her other flowers. He'd shown Ruthanne how to recognize the different varieties, how to pinch back new growth to encourage blooming, how to prepare the soil with coffee grounds and oak leaves. The work was gentle in a way that most labor wasn't, and Ruthanne had come to love those quiet hours when her hands were in the dirt and Robert was nearby, humming old songs that he said his mother had sung in Virginia before she died. It was Robert who first noticed something strange about the sealed gate in the winter of 1831. He'd been working on the camellia bed that grew against the brick wall just south of the gate itself, and he'd seen something that made him stop, trowel in hand, staring at the weathered wood. When Ruthanne asked what was wrong, he'd pointed to the base of the gate where the wood met the ground. The soil there looked disturbed, not as though someone had dug there, but as though it had been moved from beneath, pushed up gently from below. And there were marks on the wood itself, very faint, that might have been scratches or might have been something else. Patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing in a language neither of them could read. Robert had covered the disturbed soil with fresh earth and said nothing more about it, but Ruthanne had seen the way his eyes returned to the gate throughout that winter, studying it when he thought no one was watching. She'd felt it too, though she couldn't have explained what it was. A sense that the gate was different somehow, that its sealed silence had changed from the dead weight of an ending to something else, something that hummed very quietly in the moments between moments, something that suggested doors were never as solid as the men who built them believed. The Pemberton household ran on schedules as rigid as the rice plantation timetables that governed the fields beyond the city, and Ruthanne's days unfolded with the mechanical precision of a clock that never stopped winding. She woke at 4:30 each morning dressed in the dark and began her rounds of the house, carrying water and lighting fires and preparing the rooms for the family's eventual emergence from sleep. Mistress Pemberton required tea at 6 precisely, carried to her bedroom on a silver tray with the good china cup and 2 lumps of sugar and a thin slice of lemon. Master Pemberton took his breakfast at 7 in the dining room, reading the Charleston Mercury while he ate eggs and grits and demanded absolute silence from the household staff. The Pemberton children, 3 daughters ranging from 8 to 16, were Ruthanne's particular responsibility, and she dressed them and styled their hair and listened to their chatter about parties and beaux and the latest fashions from Paris. The youngest, Caroline, had a sweet disposition and would sometimes thank Ruthanne for braiding her hair, which always made Mistress Pemberton scold the child for being familiar with the help. The middle daughter, Virginia, treated Ruthanne with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never questioned her right to another person's labor. The eldest, Margaret, had recently become engaged to a rice planter's son from Beaufort, and her wedding was scheduled for June, which meant the household was in a constant state of preparation and hysteria. Ruthanne moved through these routines with the part of her mind that had learned to function without being fully present, the part that could lace a corset and pin up hair and respond with "yes, ma'am" and "right away, ma'am," while the rest of her retreated to a place where the hands on her body were her own, and the time she spent was her own, and the thoughts in her head belonged to no one but herself. It was a survival skill she'd developed slowly over the years, this ability to split herself into the part that served and the part that remained separate, untouched, hidden away where the auction block and the inspection of teeth and the casual violence couldn't quite reach. But in the spring of 1832, that hidden part of herself had become restless in a way she didn't fully understand. She found herself thinking about the sealed gate more and more, wondering about those faint markings Robert had covered with soil, wondering about the slight disturbance in the earth that suggested movement where no movement should have been possible. She began to notice other things too, small details that seemed to accumulate into a pattern she couldn't quite grasp. The way certain plants near the gate bloomed more vigorously than they should, as though the soil there was richer or the light fell differently. The way birds would sometimes gather on the wall above the gate at dawn, dozens of them singing in a chorus that felt less like bird song and more like conversation in a language just beyond comprehension. And then there were the dreams. Ruthanne had always dreamed vividly, stories that unfolded behind her sleeping eyes with the clarity of memory. But in February, the dreams changed. She began to dream about walking through the garden in darkness, moving toward the sealed gate while wearing a white dress she didn't own, her feet bare on the cold brick path. In the dreams, the gate would open for her, not because the nails came loose or the iron fell away, but because the wood itself became insubstantial, became something between solid and air, and she would walk through it as easily as walking through smoke. On the other side was a garden she'd never seen, wild and overgrown, filled with flowers that bloomed in impossible colors and trees whose leaves sang when the wind moved through them. She told Robert about the dreams one morning in March while they worked together near the gate. Ruthanne holding a basket while Robert cut back the camellia branches that had grown too long over the winter. He listened without speaking, his weathered hands steady on the pruning shears, and when she finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that she would remember later when everything had changed. He said that his grandmother, who'd been born in Africa and brought to Virginia in chains, had told him stories about doors that existed between the world of the living and the world of the dead, places where the boundary was thin enough to pass through if you knew the right words or carried the right token, or had been marked in some way that made you visible to both sides at once. Ruthanne had asked what kind of marking he meant, and Robert had touched the back of his head, where a raised scar ran from his hairline to the base of his skull, the result of being struck with a shovel handle when he was 12 years old and had been caught reading a book he'd found in Master Pemberton's study. He'd said that pain marked you, that suffering opened doors in the spirit that couldn't be opened any other way, and that maybe some doors were meant to be found by people who had walked through fire and somehow survived with their souls intact. On the night of March 16th, Ruthanne had been summoned to Mistress Pemberton's bedroom to help her prepare for bed, a task that usually took an hour or more because the woman insisted on having her hair brushed exactly 100 strokes and her face washed with rosewater and her feet rubbed with camphor oil. Master Pemberton had gone to a dinner party at the home of a fellow merchant, and Mistress Pemberton was in a bitter mood because she hadn't been invited, the slight apparently related to some social dispute involving Margaret's engagement, and the Beaufort family's concerns about the Pemberton shipping business, which had suffered losses after 2 vessels were seized by British naval patrols operating near the Caribbean. Ruthanne listened to the complaints and murmured sympathetic responses while her hands worked through Mistress Pemberton's thin hair, counting strokes silently and thinking about nothing in particular. When she finally escaped the bedroom, it was past 11, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, broken only by the creak of wood cooling and the distant sound of voices from the slave quarters behind the kitchen building. Ruthanne should have returned to her own room, a small space she shared with 2 other house servants in a building adjacent to the main house. But instead she found herself walking toward the garden, moving through shadows cast by the moon that hung low and heavy above Charleston. The garden gate stood in its usual place, sealed and silent, the trumpet vines that covered it reduced to bare branches that rattled softly in the breeze coming off the harbor. Ruthanne stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to see the details of the weathered wood and the rust stains where the iron straps had bled into the grain. She didn't know what had drawn her there, couldn't have explained the feeling that had pulled her from the house and brought her to this spot. But standing there in the darkness, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, something that might have been hope, or might have been recognition. The sense of standing on the edge of something that mattered in a way that had nothing to do with the Pemberton family or the city of Charleston, or the entire edifice of slavery that structured every moment of her waking life. She took another step forward and then another until she was close enough to touch the gate. Her hand moved almost without her willing it, palm pressing against the wood, fingers tracing the grain and the nail heads and the pattern of those faint markings that Robert had noticed months before. They were warmer than they should have been, warm enough that she could feel heat radiating through the weathered wood. And they seemed to pulse slightly as though something on the other side was pressing back, meeting her touch with its own presence. A voice behind her made her turn quickly, heart hammering. It was Robert emerging from the shadows near the kitchen building, carrying a lantern that cast wild patterns across his face. He looked worried, his eyes moving from Ruthanne to the gate and back again. He said he'd seen her leave the house and had followed because it wasn't safe for her to be wandering around after dark. Not with the patrols that sometimes came through the alleys looking for runaways, or for any excuse to exercise their authority over bodies they'd been taught to see as property rather than people. Ruthanne told him she didn't know what she was doing there, couldn't explain the pull she'd felt toward the gate, and Robert had nodded as though this made perfect sense. He'd set down the lantern and joined her in front of the gate, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Then he'd said something that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than ordinary conversation, words that felt rehearsed or remembered from another time entirely. He said that his grandmother had told him about the crossroads, the places where one world touched another, and that those places could be found anywhere if you knew how to look, in doorways and at river bends and in gardens where pain had been planted alongside flowers and had grown into something with its own power, its own terrible beauty. He said the Pemberton family had owned more than 100 enslaved people over 3 generations, and at least 40 of them had died on this property, their bodies buried in unmarked graves at the far edge of the land where the soil was poor and nothing much would grow. He said suffering soaked into the earth and changed it, made it into something between the living world and whatever came after. And maybe the gate had been soaking up that suffering for 15 years, absorbing it through the ground and the air and the tears that had fallen in its shadow, until it became something other than wood and iron, something that could recognize a person who'd earned the right to walk through it. Ruthanne had listened to this and felt the truth of it in her bones, felt it the way she'd felt her mother's absence, as a weight that had become part of her physical structure. She'd asked Robert what would happen if someone tried to walk through the gate, and he'd looked at her for a long moment before answering. He'd said he didn't know, couldn't know, but that his grandmother had believed the crossroads led to different places for different people, that the dead went to where they needed to go and the living went to where they could become more fully themselves. Shed the skins that others had forced them to wear and step into the truth of who they'd always been beneath the names and the bills of sale and the casual violence that tried to convince them they were less than human. They'd stood there for another few minutes, neither speaking, and then Robert had picked up his lantern and told Ruthanne to go back to her room before anyone noticed she was missing. She'd obeyed, moving through the darkness toward the slave quarters, but she'd looked back once and seen Robert still standing by the gate, his lantern making a small circle of light that seemed very fragile against the larger darkness that surrounded it. Sleep had been impossible that night, Ruthanne's mind too active with thoughts that spun and connected and spun apart again, forming patterns she couldn't quite hold on to long enough to understand. She lay on her narrow cot while the two other women who shared the room breathed heavily in sleep. And she thought about doors and crossroads and the possibility that the world was larger and stranger than the boundaries slavery had tried to impose on it. She thought about her mother, wondered if she was still alive on that rice plantation in Georgia, wondered if she ever thought about the daughter she'd been forced to leave behind. She thought about all the people who'd suffered and died on the Pemberton property, their names lost, their stories reduced to nothing more than entries in ledger books that recorded purchases and deaths with equal indifference. And she thought about the gate, about the warmth she'd felt radiating from the wood, about Robert's stories and his grandmother's wisdom, about the strange dreams that had been visiting her for weeks. Something was happening, she could feel it, something that existed outside the ordinary flow of cause and effect, something that suggested the universe was more responsive to human suffering than it appeared. That pain might be not just something to endure, but something that could open doors the powerful had tried to seal shut forever. When dawn came, Ruthanne rose and began her usual routines, though everything felt slightly different now, as though the night's vigil by the gate had shifted something fundamental in the way she moved through the world. She carried water and lit fires and prepared tea for Mistress Pemberton, but she did it with a distracted air that earned her a sharp rebuke from the cook, who told her to pay attention before she scalded someone or broke something valuable. Ruthanne had apologized and tried to focus, but her mind kept drifting back to the garden, to the sealed gate, to the possibility that had taken root somewhere in her chest and was growing despite every practical reason she should forget about it. The day unfolded with its usual demands, Mistress Pemberton requiring her presence for a fitting with the dressmaker who was creating Margaret's wedding gown. Then an afternoon visiting a neighbor where Ruthanne had to stand behind Mistress Pemberton's chair for 2 hours, while the Charleston elite discussed the political situation and the growing tensions between the North and the South and whether the federal government had any right to impose tariffs that hurt Southern trade. Ruthanne had learned to make herself invisible during these gatherings, to become so still and unremarkable that the white people in the room forgot she had ears and intelligence. And she listened to them debate the nature of property rights and state sovereignty while never once acknowledging that she herself was the property they claimed to be defending. When she finally returned to the house in late afternoon, she found Robert waiting near the kitchen, his face drawn with an expression she couldn't quite read. He pulled her aside, speaking quietly so the other servants wouldn't overhear, and told her that something had happened at the gate. He'd gone to work on the camellia bed that morning and had found the soil disturbed again, much more dramatically this time, as though something had pushed up from below with considerable force. And the markings on the wood were clearer now, visible without effort, symbols that looked like a combination of letters and drawings, spirals and crosses and shapes that might have been maps or might have been something else entirely. Robert had covered the disturbed soil again and said nothing to anyone else. But he'd been watching the gate all day, and he swore that sometimes when the light fell a certain way, he could see through it. Could glimpse something on the other side that wasn't the alley he knew was there, but rather something else, a space that existed between or beyond or underneath the ordinary world. He said he thought the gate was opening or preparing to open, and that whatever had been building there for 15 years was finally ready to complete itself. Ruthanne had felt a chill move through her despite the humid heat of the March afternoon, and she'd asked Robert what he thought she should do. He'd looked at her with something like sadness and said that it wasn't his place to tell her, that decisions like this had to be made by each person alone, but that he thought the gate had chosen her, or she'd chosen it, and that the opportunity it represented might not last long. He'd said that crossroads opened and closed according to their own logic, that the moments when passage was possible were brief and precious, and that hesitation often meant the door would close before you could walk through it. They'd talked for a few more minutes, Robert sharing more of what his grandmother had taught him about navigating spaces between worlds, about the importance of intention and fearlessness, about how the crossroads could sense whether you were coming to them out of desperation or out of genuine readiness to leave behind everything you'd known. Then the dinner bell had rung, summoning Ruthanne back to her duties, and she'd had to leave Robert standing in the garden, his weathered hands hanging at his sides, his eyes reflecting something that looked like both hope and grief. The evening meal had been tense. Master Pemberton still angry about some business reversal involving a shipment of cotton that had been damaged by rain during transport to the docks, Mistress Pemberton sulking about the social slight regarding the dinner party, Margaret weeping over some disagreement with her fiancé, Virginia complaining about the heat, and Caroline picking at her food and looking miserable in the way that children do when the adults around them are radiating unhappiness. Ruthanne had served and cleared and responded to demands with her usual efficiency, but inside she was calculating, thinking, weighing possibilities against risks. The risk of staying was known, measurable, the slow grinding away of everything that made her herself until she was nothing but a function, a tool the Pemberton family used without consideration or gratitude. The risk of whatever the gate offered was unknown, unmeasurable, and that made it both terrifying and irresistible. She thought about her mother, about the last time she'd seen her, hands bound, being led away to a future that offered nothing but more suffering, more loss, more of the incremental death that slavery inflicted on everyone it touched. She thought about Robert's grandmother and the wisdom that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery and had been passed down through generations. Knowledge about doors and crossroads and the ways the universe sometimes offered exits to those who'd earned them through suffering. By the time she finished her evening duties and retreated to her room, Ruthanne had made her decision. She'd made it not through rational analysis, but through something deeper, a knowing that existed below language, below thought in the part of her that had remained her own despite everything that had been done to her. She would go to the gate that night. She would stand before it and offer herself to whatever it represented. And if it opened, if passage was possible, she would walk through without hesitation, without looking back, without counting the cost, because the cost of staying had already become unbearable. She waited until the house was fully quiet, until even the restless sounds of the other servants had faded into sleep. Then she rose from her cot, moving silently in the darkness, and dressed in the only good dress she owned, a simple cotton garment that Mistress Pemberton had given her after deciding the color didn't suit her own complexion. Ruthanne had no possessions worth carrying, nothing that would survive a journey through whatever door the gate might offer. So she left empty-handed, walking out into the Charleston night with nothing but her intention and her readiness to become something other than what the Pemberton family and the city and the entire structure of slavery had tried to make her. The garden was silver with moonlight, every leaf and petal transformed by the luminous glow that made shadows deeper and made the sealed gate stand out like a wound in the brick wall. Ruthanne walked toward it slowly, each step deliberate, feeling the cool brick of the path beneath her bare feet, feeling the night air on her skin, feeling the weight of her decisions settle into her body like ballast that would keep her steady no matter what happened next. When she reached the gate, she stopped, standing exactly where she'd stood the night before, and she placed both hands against the weathered wood. The markings were glowing now, very faintly, a phosphorescent shimmer that outlined the symbols Robert had pointed out, making them readable in a way they hadn't been before. Ruthanne didn't understand the language, couldn't have translated the symbols into words she knew, but she understood their meaning anyway. Understood it the way you understand a song even when you don't speak the language it's sung in, through rhythm and tone and the emotional truth that transcends specific vocabulary. The symbols were saying welcome, saying passage, saying that the door was open for those who'd earned the right to walk through it. for those who'd survived what shouldn't be survivable and had maintained their humanity despite every effort to strip it away. Ruthanne spoke aloud then, not to the gate, but to the universe itself, to whatever force or intelligence or accident of physics had created this possibility. She said she was ready, said she understood that walking through meant leaving behind everything she'd known, everyone she'd loved, every familiar landmark that had oriented her life. She said she wasn't running away, but rather running toward, moving into a future she couldn't predict but had to believe was better than the present that offered nothing but more of the same grinding diminishment. She said she was grateful for the door, grateful for the chance, grateful even for the suffering that had made her visible to whatever power had opened this crossroads. As she spoke, she felt the wood beneath her hands change, felt it become warmer and then softer, felt it shift from solid to something with more give, more flexibility, more willingness to be moved through. The air around her seemed to thicken, to become charged with an energy she could feel on her skin like static electricity. And she heard sounds that might have been wind or might have been voices, a chorus of whispers that seemed to be encouraging her, urging her forward, telling her that the moment was now and wouldn't last much longer. She took a breath, filling her lungs with the humid Charleston air one last time, and she pressed forward, walking directly toward the gate. She expected resistance, expected her body to meet solid wood and stop, but instead she felt the boundary dissolve around her, felt herself passing through layers of sensation that shifted from solid to liquid to something like light. And then she was somewhere else, the garden behind her, and something entirely new spread out ahead. The space she'd entered wasn't the alley that should have been on the other side of the gate. It was a garden, but not any garden she'd seen before, wild and luminous, filled with plants that seemed to generate their own light, flowers that bloomed in colors she had no names for, trees whose trunks were silver and whose leaves moved even when there was no wind. The sky above was neither day nor night, but something between, a twilight that felt permanent and peaceful. And the air was cool and clean in a way that Charleston air never was, free of the humidity and the smell of the harbor and the sense of oppression that seemed to seep from every brick and board of the city. Ruthanne stood very still, taking in this impossible place, trying to understand where she was and what had happened. Behind her, she could still see the sealed gate, but it looked different from this side, transparent and shimmering, a membrane between worlds rather than a solid barrier. Through it, she could see the Pemberton garden, the brick wall, the main house looming against the night sky. She could see all of it, but it seemed very far away now, separated from her by more than just the gate, by something fundamental that couldn't be crossed again. A figure emerged from between the silver trees, moving toward her with a fluid grace that suggested familiarity with this strange landscape. As it came closer, Ruthanne saw that it was a woman, perhaps in her 60s, with dark skin and gray hair bound up in cloth, wearing a dress that looked like it had been woven from moonlight and shadows. The woman smiled at her, and there was something in that smile that suggested recognition, as though they'd met before, though Ruthanne had no memory of this person. The woman spoke, her voice clear and warm, and she said that Ruthanne was expected, that her arrival had been anticipated for some time. She said this place was called the Garden Between, and it existed outside the ordinary flow of time and space, accessible only through crossroads that opened in places where suffering had accumulated enough to tear the fabric of the world. She said many people had passed through over the years, people who'd been enslaved and beaten and diminished, but who'd never surrendered the core of themselves, who'd maintained their humanity through conditions designed to strip it away. She said this was a place of transition, a space where those who'd earned passage could rest and heal before moving on to whatever came next. Ruthanne asked what came next, and the woman's smile deepened. She said that was different for everyone, that the garden between offered many doors, many paths, many possibilities. Some people chose to remain here, to rest in this peaceful space for as long as they needed. Some chose to move forward into death, to join those who'd gone before and to find peace in reunion. And some chose to move forward into life, to be reborn into the world but in different circumstances, given another chance to experience existence without the chains and the violence and the casual cruelty that had defined their first time through. The woman said that Ruthanne had time to decide, that the garden between operated on its own schedule and there was no rush, no urgency, no one to demand her labor or her obedience or her compliance. She said there were others here, people from Charleston and from other places, people who'd found other crossroads and other gates and had walked through into this space. She said Ruthanne could meet them if she wanted, could share stories and healing and the simple pleasure of existing without fear. Ruthanne listened to all of this and felt something breaking open inside her. Some dam that had been holding back decades of grief and rage and exhaustion. She asked if her mother was here, if the woman who'd been sold away 16 years ago might have found her own crossroads, her own gate. The woman in the moonlight dress said she didn't know, said that each person's journey was their own and paths didn't always cross even in spaces like this, but that seeking was possible, that reunion was possible, that hope was not foolish here the way it had been foolish in the world Ruthanne had left behind. They talked for a long time, or perhaps no time at all, the twilight remaining constant around them while Ruthanne asked questions and the woman answered with patience and kindness. She learned that the garden between existed in many places simultaneously, that gates opened and closed constantly, that the woman she was speaking with had been enslaved in Virginia in the 1750s and had walked through a door in a barn wall after watching her husband be beaten to death for learning to read. She learned that suffering was not meaningless, that it accumulated and transformed and eventually created these spaces, these crossroads, these opportunities for escape, that existed beyond what the powerful could control or prevent. Eventually, the woman said that she needed to return to her own work, that others would be arriving soon who needed guidance and welcome, but that Ruthanne was free to explore the garden between, to find her own path through its many landscapes, to take whatever time she needed to decide what came next. Before she left, she touched Ruthanne's face gently and said that she was brave, that walking through the gate required a courage most people never discovered they possessed, and that whatever Ruthanne decided, she would be supported and honored and remembered. Ruthanne stood alone then in the silver garden, surrounded by impossible beauty and perfect peace, and she thought about the Pemberton household waking to find her gone. She thought about the confusion and anger that would erupt, the searches that would be organized, the patrols that would fan out through Charleston looking for a runaway who couldn't be found because she'd gone somewhere beyond their ability to pursue. She thought about Robert discovering the gate untouched, still sealed with its nails and iron straps, and the flowers blooming where she'd last stood, and understanding that she'd found her crossroads and walked through it without hesitation. She thought about Master Pemberton's fury and Mistress Pemberton's outrage and the way they'd never understand that their property had become a person again, that the woman they'd owned had reclaimed herself in the only way that mattered. She thought about the other enslaved people in the household, wondered if they'd hear the story and find hope in it, wondered if some of them might find their own crossroads, their own gates that opened when suffering reached a critical mass and transformed into something that could break through the boundaries the world had tried to impose. And then she stopped thinking about Charleston and the Pemberton family and everything she'd left behind. And she began to explore the garden between, walking through landscapes that shifted and changed, meeting others who'd found their own passages, learning that the universe was larger and stranger and more responsive to human pain than anyone in Charleston could possibly imagine. She walked through forests made of crystal and meadows that sang when you stepped on them and rivers that flowed backward into their sources. She met people who'd been enslaved and people who'd been imprisoned and people who'd suffered in ways she'd never imagined, all of them finding rest and healing in this space that existed outside the ordinary rules of time and death and possibility. Days passed, or perhaps years, or perhaps no time at all. The twilight remaining constant, the peace never breaking. Ruthanne found that her body changed here, that scars faded and pain dissolved, and the exhaustion that had lived in her bones for as long as she could remember finally began to lift. She talked with others about their journeys, sharing stories that created a tapestry of survival and resistance, and the stubborn refusal to be broken that had allowed all of them to find their crossroads. She learned that the garden between was both a place and a state of being, that it existed wherever suffering opened a door, and that walking through required not just courage but also the ability to believe that you deserved something better, that your humanity was real and valuable regardless of what the law said about your status as property. Eventually, Ruthanne found herself standing at another gate, this one made of woven light that shifted through colors she'd never seen before. The woman in the moonlight dress was there again, smiling that knowing smile, and she asked Ruthanne if she'd made her decision. Ruthanne said she had, said that she wanted to move forward, wanted to be reborn into the world, wanted another chance to experience life without chains, without fear, without the constant diminishment that slavery had inflicted. She said she wanted to carry the memory of what she'd learned here, wanted to remember that suffering could be transformed, that doors existed in unexpected places, that the universe was more malleable and responsive than it appeared. The woman had nodded and said that remembering was possible but difficult, that most people who moved forward into new lives forgot the garden between, forgot the journey that had brought them here, forgot everything except a vague sense that they'd been given a second chance, and should honor it. But she said that some people maintained threads of memory, kept pieces of the truth tucked away in dreams and intuitions and moments of sudden recognition when they encountered others who'd also walked through crossroads. She said Ruthanne would have to decide for herself how much to remember, how much to carry forward, how much weight memory would add to the new life she was choosing. Ruthanne thought about this carefully, weighing the value of memory against the burden it represented. In the end, she decided to remember everything, to carry forward the full weight of what she'd experienced and learned, because forgetting felt like a betrayal of the woman she'd been, the enslaved person who'd maintained her humanity through conditions designed to destroy it. She wanted to honor that woman, wanted to remember her courage and her pain and her ultimate refusal to accept that sealed gates were permanent. The woman in the moonlight dress had looked pleased by this decision, and she'd taken Ruthanne's hand and led her to the gate of woven light. She'd explained that walking through this gate was different from walking through the crossroads that had brought her to the garden between, that this passage moved forward rather than sideways, that it would take her into a future that didn't yet exist but would be shaped partly by her choices and partly by forces beyond anyone's control. She said the world Ruthanne would enter was still troubled, still marked by suffering and injustice, but that it was changing slowly, that the work of transformation was ongoing and needed people who understood what freedom truly meant. Ruthanne had thanked the woman, thanked her for the welcome and the guidance and the gift of this space where healing was possible. Then she'd turned to face the gate of woven light, feeling the same mix of fear and readiness she'd felt standing before the sealed gate in the Pemberton garden. She took a breath, filling her lungs with the cool, clean air of the garden between one last time, and she walked forward into the shifting colors, into the unknown, into a future that would be hers to shape in ways that had been impossible in the world she'd left behind. Back in Charleston on the morning of March 17, 1832, the Pemberton household woke to confusion and consternation when Ruthanne White couldn't be found. The search began immediately, Master Pemberton organizing his enslaved people into groups to check every building and every corner of the property, while Mistress Pemberton alternated between fury at the disruption and anxiety about what the disappearance might mean for their social standing. Margaret wept dramatically, convinced that this disaster would somehow ruin her wedding plans. Virginia complained that she'd have to dress herself. Caroline said nothing but looked sad in a way that suggested she understood something the adults had missed. Robert was part of the search party, and he made sure to be the one who checked the garden. When he found the sealed gate untouched, still secured with its rusted nails and iron straps exactly as it had been for 15 years, he felt his heart lift with something that was equal parts grief and joy. And when he saw the white camellias blooming in the frost where Ruth Ann had last stood, flowers that shouldn't have been possible for another month at least, he understood that she'd found her crossroads and walked through it, that she'd done what he'd only dreamed of doing, that she'd escaped in the one way that couldn't be undone or tracked or punished. He said nothing to the others, simply reported that he'd checked the garden and found no sign of the missing woman. Master Pemberton organized patrols, sent men to check with other households, contacted the city authorities to report a runaway, offered a reward for information leading to her capture. But Charleston was a big city, and the swamps beyond it were bigger, and enslaved people disappeared sometimes, running north or hiding in maroon communities or simply vanishing into the spaces between plantation and city where survival was possible if you were desperate enough and clever enough and lucky enough. The Pemberton family never found Ruth Ann White, never learned what had happened to her, never understood that their sealed gate had become something other than what they'd believed it to be. The white camellias bloomed in the wrong season and then faded, leaving behind no evidence except a story that Robert told to a few trusted people. A story about crossroads and suffering and doors that opened when pain reached a critical mass and transformed into something that could break through sealed wood and iron straps and the entire structure of slavery that tried to convince everyone that some people were property, and property couldn't become people again. The story spread slowly, quietly, passed from person to person in whispers and songs and coded messages that the powerful couldn't intercept or understand. It became part of the oral history of Charleston's enslaved community, a story about a woman who'd walked through a gate that was nailed shut, who'd found her crossroads and moved through it into somewhere else, somewhere better, somewhere the masters couldn't follow. The story offered hope to people who had little reason to hope, suggested that the universe was more responsive to suffering than it appeared, that doors existed in unexpected places, that escape was possible even when every rational calculation said otherwise. Years later, after the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished, after the Pemberton family had lost their wealth and their property and their certainty that the world would always be organized according to their preferences, someone found the sealed gate and decided to open it. They pried off the iron straps and pulled out the rusted nails and swung the weathered wood open to reveal, as expected, the alley that ran behind the property. But they also found something unexpected, carved into the wood on the inside of the gate, symbols that looked like a combination of letters and drawings, spirals and crosses and shapes that might have been maps or might have been something else entirely. Markings that glowed very faintly in the twilight and seemed to suggest that doors were never as solid as the men who built them believed. Robert lived to see emancipation, survived the war and the chaos that followed, and spent his final years working as a paid gardener for a black church in Charleston that had been established by formerly enslaved people. He tended flowers and trees and told stories to anyone who would listen. Stories about his grandmother and her wisdom about crossroads. Stories about suffering and transformation. Stories about a woman named Ruthanne White who'd walked through a sealed gate in 1832 and had shown everyone watching that freedom was not something that could be given or withheld by the powerful, but rather something that existed beyond their control, in spaces between worlds, in gardens that bloomed outside time, in the courage it took to walk toward an uncertain future when the certain present had become unbearable. But Robert's journey from that morning of Ruthanne's disappearance to the freedom he would eventually know was long and marked by its own trials, its own moments of desperation and revelation. In the days following March 17, 1832, he'd watched the Pemberton household descend into suspicion and anger, saw the way Master Pemberton interrogated every enslaved person on the property with increasing violence, desperate to understand how a woman could vanish from a locked compound without anyone seeing or hearing anything unusual. Robert had endured his own interrogation, standing in the study while Master Pemberton demanded answers, threatened punishment, promised rewards for information, all while Robert maintained the careful mask he'd worn for 35 years. The expression that suggested just enough intelligence to be useful, but not enough to be threatening. He'd told Master Pemberton the truth as far as it went, that he'd seen Ruthanne near the garden gate the night before she disappeared, that they'd spoken briefly about the camellias, that she'd seemed troubled but hadn't confided anything about running away. What he didn't mention were the dreams, the markings on the gate, the conversation about crossroads and his grandmother's wisdom, the sense that both of them had shared that something impossible was becoming possible in that corner of the garden where suffering had soaked into the soil for 15 years. He didn't mention any of this because he knew it would sound like madness to Master Pemberton, whose world was built on the certainty that physical barriers were permanent, that locked gates stayed locked, that property couldn't transform itself into something that existed beyond ownership. In the weeks that followed, Robert found himself drawn to the garden gate with increasing frequency, tending the camellia bed with extra care, studying the sealed wood for any changes, any signs that the crossroads might open again. He found none. The gate remained as it had been, weathered and silent, the markings no longer glowing, the soil beneath it showing no signs of disturbance. It was as though Ruthanne's passage had exhausted whatever power had accumulated there, used up the energy that suffering had built over years of pain and loss. Robert felt both disappointment and relief at this, disappointed that the door wouldn't open for him, but relieved that perhaps it had served its purpose, had saved one person who desperately needed saving. But he noticed other things in the garden that spring, subtle changes that suggested Ruthanne's passage had left marks on the physical world beyond just the white camellias that had bloomed out of season. The plants near the gate grew more vigorously than they should, their leaves darker green, their flowers larger and more fragrant. Birds gathered there more frequently, not just at dawn but throughout the day, as though the spot held some attraction that Robert couldn't perceive but they could. And sometimes, when the light fell at particular angles in early morning or late evening, Robert thought he could see something through the gate, not the alley that should have been there, but a glimpse of somewhere else, a flash of silver trees and luminous flowers that vanished as soon as he tried to focus on it directly. He began to share Ruthanne's story with others carefully at first, choosing his audience with the caution that came from living in a world where words could be deadly, where the wrong thing said to the wrong person could result in beatings or sale or death. He told Judith, who worked in the kitchen and had been a friend of Ruthanne's, showing her the spot where the white camellias had bloomed. He told Marcus, who worked in the stables and had lost his wife to fever 3 years before and carried a grief so heavy it seemed to slow his movements, make every gesture weighted with sorrow. He told Clara, who was 16 and terrified because Master Pemberton had been looking at her with an expression that suggested his intentions toward her had nothing to do with her labor, and everything to do with his belief that enslaved women's bodies belonged to him in ways that went beyond work. Each person he told responded differently to the story. Judith had wept and said she hoped Ruthanne had found peace, that wherever the gate had led was better than the world they were trapped in. Marcus had asked quiet, probing questions about the crossroads, about Robert's grandmother's wisdom about whether such doors might open again for others who needed them. Clara had listened with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail, storing the information against some future need, and Robert had recognized in her expression something he'd seen in Ruthanne's face in those final weeks, a readiness to take enormous risks if it meant the possibility of escape. The story spread through the enslaved community in Charleston through channels that white people rarely understood or even noticed, passed in brief conversations during market errands, in songs that contained coded messages, in the careful choreography of information exchange that existed beneath the surface of every interaction. Robert heard versions of Ruthanne's story coming back to him from people he'd never met, each version slightly different, embellished or simplified depending on the teller, but all maintaining the core truth that a woman had walked through a sealed gate and vanished into freedom that existed beyond the reach of masters and overseers and slave catchers. Some versions said Ruthanne had been a conjure woman who'd learned magic from African ancestors and had used it to dissolve the iron and wood. Others said she'd been helped by spirits of the dead, that the 40 people buried at the edge of the Pemberton property had risen to open the gate for her. Still others said she'd found a tunnel beneath the gate, an underground passage that led to the river and from there to freedom in the north. Robert never corrected these versions, understanding that the literal truth mattered less than what the story represented. The hope it offered, the suggestion that escape was possible even when every practical consideration said otherwise. As months became years, Robert noticed that the story's impact went beyond hope. He began to hear about other disappearances in Charleston, enslaved people who vanished under circumstances that couldn't be easily explained, leaving behind no trails, no evidence of flight, sometimes leaving behind flowers that bloomed out of season, or birds that gathered in unusual numbers or spots where the air seemed to shimmer with possibilities just beyond perception. Not all of these disappearances were like Ruthanne's. Some were conventional escapes to the north or to maroon communities in the swamps. But some had elements that suggested crossroads, suggested doors opening in unexpected places for people who'd earned passage through suffering. The Pemberton household changed after Ruthanne's disappearance in ways both obvious and subtle. Master Pemberton became more paranoid, instituting stricter controls, more frequent head counts, locks on doors that had previously been left open. Mistress Pemberton's bitterness deepened, her complaints about Charleston society becoming more vitriolic, her treatment of the remaining house servants harsher. Margaret's wedding took place in June as planned, but the celebration was muted, shadowed by the scandal of a runaway slave that suggested the Pemberton household wasn't as well controlled as other elite families expected. Virginia and Caroline grew into young women marked by their mother's bitterness and their father's paranoia. Though Caroline retained some of the sweetness Robert had noticed in her as a child, sometimes leaving food near the kitchen for the enslaved workers, sometimes saying thank you in ways her mother would have punished if she'd heard. Robert watched the family decline slowly over the years, Master Pemberton's shipping business suffering losses he couldn't recover from, Mistress Pemberton dying of fever in 1843, the daughters marrying and moving away. The household shrinking as the family's fortune diminished. Through all of this, Robert maintained his work in the garden, the one constant in a world that was shifting in ways he couldn't fully understand. He'd been promised freedom in Master Pemberton's will, a promise made when Robert was young and had saved the old man's life by pulling him from a warehouse fire, but promises made to enslaved people were as substantial as morning mist. and Robert knew better than to count on anything beyond the present moment. He tended the camellias and the roses and the magnolias, shaped the hedges and pruned the fruit trees, and kept watch over the sealed gate that had opened once for Ruthanne and might open again for someone else. In 1856, when Robert was 66 years old and his hands had begun to ache from decades of labor, Clara came to him in the garden early one morning, her face showing the kind of determination he'd learned to recognize. She was 30 now, had survived Master Pemberton's unwanted attention through a combination of strategic illness and the intervention of her mother, who'd threatened to kill him if he touched her daughter. She'd married another enslaved man named Jacob 3 years before, and they had a daughter who was 2 years old, a bright child with her mother's intensity and her father's quick laugh. Clara told Robert that the family who'd purchased Jacob 5 years ago was planning to sell him to a cotton planter in Alabama, that the sale was scheduled for the following week, that she couldn't bear to be separated from her husband and wouldn't let her daughter grow up without a father. She said she'd been thinking about Ruthanne's story for years, had been watching the garden gate, had noticed the same things Robert had noticed, the vigorous plants, the gathering birds, the occasional shimmer in the air that suggested boundaries were less solid than they appeared. She asked Robert if he thought the gate might open again, if crossroads appeared only once, or if they were permanent features of the landscape, waiting for people who needed them. Robert had considered her question carefully, thinking about his grandmother's teachings, about the years he'd spent watching the gate, about the glimpses of silver trees and luminous flowers he'd sometimes seen when the light fell right. He told Clara that he believed crossroads could open more than once, that places where suffering had soaked into the earth retained that power, that capacity to become doorways when the need was great enough and the person seeking passage had been marked by pain in ways that made them visible to whatever force created these opportunities. He told her about intention and fearlessness, about the importance of approaching the crossroads not from desperation alone, but from a deep readiness to leave behind everything you'd known, everyone you'd loved, every familiar anchor that had oriented your life. Clara had listened to all of this and then asked if Robert would help her, if he would tend the gate and watch over her attempt to walk through it, bear witness to her passage or her failure so that either way someone would know what she'd tried to do. Robert had agreed, feeling the weight of this responsibility settle onto shoulders that had carried so much already, understanding that he was becoming something like a keeper of the crossroads, a guardian of this impossible door that existed in the Pemberton garden. They planned carefully over the following days, Clara telling Jacob what she intended to try. Both of them understanding that if the gate opened and she walked through with their daughter, he would be left behind, would have to live with not knowing what had happened to them, whether they'd found freedom or died in the attempt or ended up somewhere in between. Jacob had struggled with this knowledge, the choice between certain separation through sale versus uncertain separation through the crossroads. But in the end, he'd agreed, understanding that Clara's attempt gave their daughter a chance that slavery would never provide, a possibility of growing up free and whole and unmolested by the casual violence that marked every enslaved child's existence. On the night of June 3, 1856, Clara came to the garden carrying her sleeping daughter wrapped in a shawl. Robert was waiting near the gate, a lantern providing small illumination against the larger darkness. The night was humid and still, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the sound of insects. Clara walked to the gate slowly, each step deliberate, and she placed one hand against the weathered wood while holding her daughter with the other arm. Robert watched from a few feet away, remembering the last time he'd stood in this spot watching someone approach the crossroads, remembering Ruthanne's face in the moonlight, the determination and fear mixed together, the sense that she was stepping into something that would either save her or destroy her. Clara spoke to the gate in a language Robert didn't understand, Words that might have been African or might have been something else entirely. Something learned from dreams or ancestors, or the deep knowledge that survived in the blood despite the Middle Passage and slavery and every attempt to strip away cultural memory. As she spoke, Robert saw the markings on the wood begin to glow again. Very faintly at first, but growing brighter. The symbols and spirals and patterns pulsing with phosphorescent light. The air around Clara seemed to thicken, become charged with energy, and the child in her arms stirred but didn't wake, as though the power gathering there recognized her innocence and worked to protect her sleep. Clara pressed forward, walking directly toward the sealed gate, and Robert saw the wood begin to change, saw it shift from solid to something more flexible, more willing to be moved through. The boundary dissolved around her exactly as it had for Ruthanne 24 years before, and Clara passed through layers that shifted from wood to light to something that existed beyond any category Robert had words for. Then she was gone, vanished into whatever space the crossroads led to, and the gate returned to its usual state, sealed and weathered and showing no evidence that anything unusual had happened. Robert stood alone in the garden, feeling the same mix of grief and joy he'd felt when Ruthanne disappeared. Grief for the loss of someone he'd cared about. Joy that she'd found her passage, her escape, her doorway into possibilities that slavery had tried to deny. He waited there for several hours until dawn began to lighten the sky, and when he finally left to begin his morning work, he saw white camellias blooming where Clara had stood, exactly as they'd bloomed where Ruthanne had stood, flowers that shouldn't have been possible in June heat, but were there anyway, marking the spot where suffering had transformed into power. Jacob learned of his wife's disappearance when Master Pemberton roused the household to demand explanations, and Robert watched the man's face carefully, saw the way grief and hope warred there, the understanding that Clara had tried something desperate and had either succeeded or failed in ways that Jacob would never fully know. The search that followed was perfunctory, Master Pemberton less willing to invest resources in finding a missing enslaved woman and child than he'd been 24 years earlier. His fortune diminished, his energy depleted, his certainty about the permanence of his authority eroded by years of losses. Jacob was sold to the Alabama cotton planter as planned, and Robert never learned what became of him, whether he survived the brutal conditions of plantation labor, whether he ever found peace or happiness or another chance at the family that had been taken from him. But Robert carried the memory of Clara's passage, added it to the story of Ruthanne's disappearance, and continued to share these stories with anyone who seemed ready to hear them. Anyone whose suffering had marked them deeply enough that they might recognize the truth about crossroads and gates, and the way the universe sometimes offered exits that existed beyond what the powerful could control. The years that followed brought enormous changes to Charleston and to the entire South. Changes that Robert watched with a mixture of hope and skepticism born from 60 years of broken promises. The political tensions between North and South that had simmered for decades finally erupted into war in 1861, and Charleston found itself at the center of the conflict. The first shots fired at Fort Sumter in the harbor, the city transformed into a military stronghold that would eventually be reduced to rubble and ash. Robert lived through the siege, the bombardments, the slow starvation as Union forces blockaded the harbor, the eventual surrender and occupation. He lived through the moment in 1865 when Union soldiers announced that slavery was ended, that the 4 million people held in bondage across the South were legally free, that the entire structure that had defined his existence for 68 years was dismantled by military force and presidential proclamation. Robert had stood in a crowd of newly freed people in Charleston, listening to the announcement, and he'd felt something break open in his chest that had been locked tight for so long he'd forgotten it was capable of opening. Freedom wasn't what he'd imagined as a young man. It came too late and cost too much and left him with nothing but his aging body and his memories and his skill at tending gardens. But it was real, tangible, a legal fact that couldn't be reversed by individual masters or state legislatures or anyone's property claims. He'd returned to the Pemberton property in those first confused months after the war ended, not because he owed the family anything, but because the garden needed tending and because the sealed gate remained there, still marking the spot where two women had found their crossroads and walked through into freedom that predated legal emancipation. Master Pemberton was dead by then, killed during the siege when a shell had destroyed part of the house, and Mistress Constance's daughters had scattered, leaving the property abandoned and slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. Robert had worked to maintain the garden through those years, living in the kitchen building and supporting himself by selling flowers and vegetables to Charleston's residents, Black and White, who were all struggling to rebuild lives in a city that had been physically and economically devastated. He'd transformed the Pemberton property into something that served the newly freed community, a space where people could come to rest and talk and share stories about survival and loss and the strange new reality of freedom that had been won through so much blood and suffering. And he'd continued to tend the sealed gate, which had become something of a pilgrimage site for people who'd heard the stories about Ruthanne and Clara, people who wanted to see the place where the crossroads had opened, where women had walked through impossible barriers into something beyond the reach of masters. Robert would show them the gate, tell them the stories, share his grandmother's wisdom about suffering and transformation, and the way pain could open doors that existed outside ordinary space and time. Some visitors were skeptical, believing the stories were metaphors or exaggerations, useful myths that had helped people survive slavery, but not literal truth about gates that dissolved and gardens that existed between worlds. Others believed completely, and some of these believers claimed they could see the shimmer Robert sometimes saw, the glimpse of silver trees and luminous flowers that suggested the boundary was still thin there, still permeable for those who had eyes to see it. In 1873, when Robert was 83 years old and his body had become so frail that tending the garden required enormous effort, a young woman came to see the sealed gate, brought by her grandmother who'd known Ruthanne White when they'd both been enslaved in Charleston. The young woman's name was Hope, given to her at birth by a mother who'd believed deeply in Ruthanne's story, who'd understood that the crossroads represented not just individual escape, but collective possibility. The promise that suffering could be transformed rather than simply endured. Hope had grown up free, born after emancipation, and she carried herself with a confidence that Robert found both beautiful and unsettling. A confidence that came from never having been property, never having learned the masks and careful movements that had defined Robert's entire life. She asked Robert to tell her everything he knew about the crossroads, about his grandmother's teachings, about Ruthanne and Clara and the way they'd walked through sealed wood into somewhere else. She said she was gathering stories about resistance and survival, writing them down so they wouldn't be lost, so that future generations would understand the full truth about slavery and the many ways people had fought against it, escaped from it, transformed its violence into something that created doorways rather than just scars. Robert had told her everything, unburdening himself of 60 years of accumulated knowledge and witness, and as he talked, he felt something shifting, some weight he'd been carrying finally beginning to lift. He told her about the markings on the gate, the way they glowed when someone with the right kind of suffering approached, the way the wood became permeable, the glimpses of silver trees and impossible gardens. He told her about his grandmother's wisdom, the stories about crossroads and the world between living and dying, the belief that pain marked you in ways that made you visible to forces most people never perceived. Hope had listened to all of this and written it down in a leather journal, her hand moving quickly across the pages, capturing Robert's words before they could be lost. When he finished talking, she thanked him and said that his stories mattered, that they were part of a larger history about resistance and survival, and the ways people had maintained their humanity through conditions designed to strip it away. She said she would make sure the stories were preserved, passed down, kept alive through generations that would need to remember where they'd come from and what it had cost their ancestors to survive. Robert died 3 years later in 1876, working in the garden on a hot summer afternoon. His hands in the soil he'd tended for nearly 70 years, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of age and labor. They buried him in the cemetery attached to the black church where he'd worked, and dozens of people came to his funeral. People who'd known him, people who'd heard his stories, people whose own lives had been touched by the hope that the crossroads represented. The Pemberton property was eventually sold and subdivided, the garden parceled out and built over, the sealed gate removed when the brick wall was torn down to make way for new construction. But before the gate was destroyed, someone had carefully documented those mysterious markings on the wood, drawing them precisely, preserving them in a way that allowed the patterns to survive even after the physical gate was gone. Those drawings eventually found their way into Hope's collection, part of the archive of resistance and survival she'd spent her life building. And they remained there as evidence that doors existed in unexpected places, that suffering could transform into power, that freedom was not just a legal status but a state of being that could be accessed through courage and intention, and the refusal to accept that sealed gates were permanent. And somewhere in a space that existed outside Charleston and outside time and outside the ordinary boundaries of life and death, Ruthanne walked through gardens that never stopped blooming, met people who'd found their own crossroads and carried forward the memory of everything she'd been and everything she'd learned. She remembered the Pemberton household and the sealed gate and the moment when suffering had transformed into something powerful enough to break through wood and iron and the entire structure of slavery. She remembered, and that memory became part of the landscape of the garden between, part of the story that welcomed others who found their own passages, part of the proof that the universe was larger and stranger and more responsive to human pain than anyone who'd never suffered could possibly imagine. The gate in the Pemberton garden remained standing for another 60 years before the property was subdivided and sold and eventually developed into the streets and houses and shops that make up that part of Charleston today. But the story of Ruthanne White and the sealed gate that she walked through never entirely disappeared. Kept alive by descendants of the people who'd known Robert, passed down through generations as a reminder that doors exist in unexpected places, that suffering can be transformed into power, that freedom is not something that can be permanently denied to those who refuse to accept that sealed gates are permanent. And on certain nights, if you know where to look and when to look and how to see with more than just your ordinary vision, you can still find crossroads in Charleston, gates that shimmer between solid and translucent, spaces where the boundary between worlds grows thin enough to pass through. You can find them in gardens and in alleys and in the spaces between buildings marked by flowers that bloom out of season and birds that gather at dawn singing songs that sound almost like language. You can find them if you've earned the right to see them, if you've survived what shouldn't be survivable, if you've maintained your humanity through conditions designed to strip it away. And if you find one, if you stand before a crossroads and feel the boundary dissolving, if you hear voices encouraging you forward and feel warmth radiating from wood or brick or whatever material the door is made from, you might choose to walk through, might choose to follow Ruthanne White into the garden between, might choose to believe that the universe is more malleable and responsive than it appears, that suffering opens doors the powerful can't seal shut, that freedom exists in spaces beyond the law and beyond property claims and beyond every structure that tries to convince some people they're less than human. The story doesn't end because stories like this never end. They just continue unfolding, creating new chapters with every person who finds their crossroads and walks through with courage and intention, and the stubborn refusal to accept that the world will always be organized according to someone else's preferences. Ruthanne White walked through a sealed gate in 1832, and in doing so, she opened a door that has remained open ever since. Available to anyone who needs it badly enough and who's survived enough to see it and who's brave enough to take that step forward into the unknown. And that, perhaps, is the real story, not the disappearance itself, but the door that the disappearance revealed, the crossroads that suffering created, the garden between worlds where healing is possible and where those who've been diminished can become whole again. That's the story that matters, the story that's worth remembering, the story that Ruthanne White left behind when she walked through impossible wood and iron into somewhere else, somewhere better. Somewhere that existed beyond the reach of masters and bills of sale and every attempt to convince the world that some people were property and property couldn't transform itself back into people. She walked through and the gate remained sealed and the flowers bloomed where she'd stood, and Charleston woke to a mystery it couldn't solve because the answer existed in spaces the powerful had never learned to see. She walked through and she was free. And that freedom rippled outward through time and space and story, offering hope to everyone who heard about it, everyone who wondered if escape was possible, everyone who stood before their own sealed gates and wondered if they had the courage to walk forward into the unknown. The answer, as Ruthanne White proved on March 17, 1832, was yes. The courage existed. The doors existed, the crossroads were real, and freedom, true freedom, the kind that existed beyond law and property and every structure that tried to limit human possibility, was available to those who refused to accept that sealed gates were permanent, that suffering was meaningless, that the universe was indifferent to human pain. She walked through, and in walking through, she proved that everything the powerful believed about control and property and the permanence of their authority was wrong. And somewhere, in a garden that blooms outside time, in a space between worlds where suffering transforms into power and pain becomes the key that unlocks doors, Ruthanne White walks among silver trees and impossible flowers, carrying forward the memory of what she survived and what she learned and what she proved by taking that final step through wood and iron into freedom. She walks, and she remembers, and her story continues, offering hope and proof and the promise that crossroads exist wherever people need them badly enough, that gates can be walked through regardless of nails and iron straps, that freedom is not something that can be permanently withheld from those who refuse to accept their diminishment. She walked through the sealed gate, and in doing so, she walked into legend, into hope, into the living proof that the world is larger and stranger and more responsive to human courage than anyone trapped within ordinary boundaries can fully comprehend. And that is the story of Ruthanne White, enslaved woman of Charleston, who found her crossroads in a sealed garden gate and walked through it into freedom, leaving behind nothing but blooming flowers and an unsolvable mystery and a story that would echo through the centuries, reminding everyone who heard it that doors exist in unexpected places, and that sometimes, if you're brave enough and desperate enough and human enough, you can walk straight through wood and iron and every barrier the world has erected between you and your freedom.